Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Willem van der Brugge and I am the Secretary General of the Confederation of European Probation, CEP. We are delighted to have you here and participate in this webinar. The title of the webinar is called Sharing Experience Regarding Electronic Monitoring During the COVID-19 Pandemic, State of Play. As we all know, it has been more than a year now since COVID-19 crossed our lives and highly impacted our work in the field of probation and criminal justice. This webinar serves as a replacement for the postponed 2020 CEP Electronic Monitoring Conference. The biannual CEP EM conferences have become more or less a tradition in Europe and beyond. The 12th edition will be hosted by our dear colleagues from the Criminal Sanctions Agency, Finland. And good to know is that this 12th edition of the CEP EM conference will take place from the 23rd until the 25th of May 2022. So more or less a year from now. And again, the EM prep group managed to compose an interesting program. And I know many of you are looking forward to come to Helsinki next year. For more information and registration, check the CEP website. Now something brief about CEP. The Confederation of European Probation is a non-political, non-governmental organization which brings together probation services from around Europe. CEP currently has 35 countries in membership, of which are 25 EU member states, large and small, new and old probation organizations from north to south and east to west. In 1981, so 40 years ago, it was the number of foreign prisoners in Europe that gave 11 members, at that time Western European countries, cause to join forces and found the CEP. CEP is the single largest European network organization for the sector of probation and community justice, with the capacity to reach probation staff at both a managerial and an executive level, practitioners and middle managers. It includes academic and researchers in probation from all over Europe in its network, both as individuals and as member universities and research institutes. CEP promotes pan-European cooperation in the development and delivery of community sanctions and measures. All activities of CEP, from online conferences and workshops, publications such as Probation in Europe, the CEP website and newsletters are targeted towards the probation sector across all European jurisdictions, specifically towards the member organizations. CEP has its headquarters in Utrecht, the Netherlands. But let's go back to the webinar. I hope you all downloaded the program. We have two eminent speakers today, Mrs. Kara Tabatnik and Professor Mike Nellis. And you can see that towards the end of the webinar, there is a 15 minutes time slot for questions and answers. Pedro Ferraro Marum, chair of the Electronic Monitoring Preparatory Group, will join us for the Q&A. We also will give the floor to the technology providers, I can say loyal sponsors, to let them share briefly the challenges they faced during the Corona crisis regarding the use of electronic monitoring. I will come back to that later. And you might have noticed in the program there is even a coffee break halfway. And please ask your questions via the Q&A function and not via the chat. Good to know is that all sessions will be recorded and that we will publish the webinar materials on the CEP website and media for your reference. We will now show you the program again. As mentioned before, the 12th edition of the Electronic Monitoring Conference in 2022 will be hosted by our dear colleagues from the Criminal Sanctions Agency of Finland, also known as RISE. That's why we asked Mr. Arto Kujala, Director General of the Criminal Sanctions Agency, to open this EM webinar. Mr. Arto Kujala, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Willem, and ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues. First of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to welcome you all to the next year's conference in Helsinki, and thank you for this opportunity to join this webinar. First of all, I cannot just claim that I didn't have time enough to prepare for this speech, because originally I was supposed to hold this welcoming speech at the EM conference in Helsinki in April last year. So there has been plenty of time. The event was first postponed to December and then again to this May. And now I finally get to hold this speech, but only to welcome you to Helsinki next year, thanks to COVID pandemic. Well, I will come back to the conference next year later, but before that, I would like to say some words about probation in Finland in general, and especially regarding the theme of this webinar. The probation work has over a 150-year history in Finland. It consists of many stages, but since 2010, probation work and prisons have operated under one unified service, the Criminal Sanctions Agency. As unified service, our goal is to promote seamless and functional cooperation between these two forms of sanctions. The theme of this webinar, electronic monitoring, is actually a very good example of this cooperation. In this area, even the legislative line between community sanctions and prison sentences has become somewhat blurred. Prisons who have followed the sentence plans can be placed in probationary liberty under electronic supervision outside the prison before the actual conditional release. It means that the prisoners can live at home just like those serving community sanctions, but they are still considered prisoners. We also use electronic monitoring in open prisons that are in urban areas, and therefore we can genuinely say that electronic monitoring is a tool shared throughout the whole service, both in probation and in prisons. To give you a rough idea of the scope of probation work in Finland, I give you some key figures. The daily number of probation clients is about 3,000. We have 14 probation offices and about 250 people working in them. All clients are assigned their own probation officer, who is the case manager and works closely with the client and the client's network. We started in Finland to use electronic monitoring in 2011 with radio frequency technology. In 2012, a new legislation allowed us to use GPS technology as well. Nowadays, we have approximately 800 people under electronic monitoring daily, and the National Control Center for Electronic Monitoring functions 24/7 basis. We use radio frequency technology when we supervise people serving monitoring sentences. It's the so-called front door alternative of electronic monitoring. And we use GPS-based electronic monitoring in the implementation of the probationary liberty under supervision, which is the so-called backdoor alternative. It is an important principle to use electronic monitoring only as a tool of control. It is not the objective itself. The aim of monitoring sentences and probationary liberty under supervision is to promote the desistance process and to support the client's social integration and rehabilitation. Meetings with the probation officers and the supervision patrols are part of the work with the clients, just as interventions and rehabilitation programs, which are applied according to each client's individual needs. Unannounced home visits and alcohol and drug tests are included in electronic monitoring programs. In Finland, we also use GPS-based electronic monitoring as a method of control in open prisons that are located in town centers. This is considered an appropriate way to use electronic monitoring due to the nature of the prisoners' daily activities in these open prisons. The prisoners' work attend classes at schools or universities, and take part in rehabilitative activities outside the prison area daily. In addition, electronic monitoring is used when a person is imposed house arrest or intensified travel ban instead of remand imprisonment. It is recognized internationally that the risk of net widening in the use of electronic monitoring is something that all jurisdictions should be aware of. And this is a fact in Finland too. Generally, we can say that the use of electronic monitoring has progressed in small steps with careful consideration based on the individual, societal, and legislative point of view. The latest development in the field of electronic monitoring is a legislative proposal for its use as part of an intensified restraining order in Finland. This proposal is included in the governmental program to decrease domestic violence. The COVID-19 pandemic has not had a significant effect on the use of electronic monitoring after the general confusion at the beginning once the new practices were taken into use. Because of the pandemic, we have not been able to meet clients in person, but we have contacted them mainly via the telephone. The coronavirus situation has had most impact on community service because service places have been closed or have not been able to take community service clients because of protective measures. In addition, municipal treatment and rehabilitation services that are normally part of community sanctions have not been available. This has increased the workload of probation officers as they have had to do more psychosocial work in addition to their normal tasks. And this applies also to the enforcement of electronic monitoring. But now, dear colleagues, as I promised at the beginning, I will now return to warmly welcoming you to the conference next year, and I'm convinced that we can organize that next year. I thought it would be a good idea to help you to prepare for the conference trip to Helsinki with a short orientation video of the Finnish society. And Thank you. I think the list in the video was quite comprehensive, but still I would like to add two things regarding the prison and probation services. According to the Council of Europe's space statistics, we in Finland have the lowest correctional population rate in Europe. That is the lowest combined number of probationers and prisoners in comparison with the general population. I think that was not mentioned in the video. And for some reason, an important comparative figure hasn't been included in the space statistics. In Finland, we have counted that we have in our 26 prisons roughly 120 saunas for prisoners. And this is something unique for Finland. And that makes an average of 1 sauna per 25 prisoners. And I'm almost certain that we have the highest density of prison saunas in the world. And please correct me if I'm wrong. And ladies and gentlemen, after this short orientation to the Finnish society, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to Helsinki next year. And I really hope that we will be able to meet in person and have a fruitful conference. So welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kujala. I think you made it quite clear why we all have to come to Helsinki next year. And I hope we all do, of course. And I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, I said something about saunas. You don't have to.
Yeah.
You don't have to.
No. I think you're probably right. It'll be the highest number in the world. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kujala. I now like to introduce the first speaker, Mrs. Kara Tabaknik. Well, I can say she has a very dynamic CV. She's a very busy lady. But let's make a start. For the past decade, Kara Tabaknik has been reporting and writing about crime, trafficking, and human rights issues in the United States and also abroad. Her work touches on all aspects of justice, including policing, migration, prisons, drugs, technology, and violence. And Carla began her career as a crime reporter for Newsday, one of New York's largest daily newspapers. And over the years, he has written for publications for various worldwide magazines, but also for the Bloomberg Business Week, the Washington Post magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, and the Scientific American. And in addition to writing and reporting, Kara works in global media capacity development training, journalists around the world. Currently, she trains female reporters in parts of Asia and Africa on public health issues, including trafficking, gender-based violence, and exploitation. From 2008 till 2015, she was the Deputy Director of the Center on Media, Crime and Justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. While there, she also served the Managing Editor of the daily news service, The Crime Report. Kara is a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism and splits her time between Brooklyn, New York, and southern Spain. Summer 2020, Kara wrote an article called "A Bigger Market for Electronic Ankle Monitors. Correction centers are stocking up on electronic monitors as they release prisoners due to COVID-19. That article triggered the EM Prep Group. That's why we asked Kara to contribute to this CEP webinar. I will send you a link via the chat to that article. Kara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem. I appreciate the introduction and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here today. It's a real pleasure to present to you guys about an article I wrote at the beginning of the COVID pandemic and the rise of electronic monitoring. So I'm going to share my screen for the presentation. So just give me 1 minute while I do that. And I'm going to start the presentation. That is good. Okay, so in the early days of the pandemic, I was actually writing another story about electronic monitoring for domestic violence. And in that time, I had called a source. This is how the story came about. I had called a source to speak about the story, But he had said to me at that point that he couldn't talk because they were too busy fulfilling new orders in the rush for electronic monitoring when they were releasing prisoners due to COVID. So that's how the story came about. During my reporting, I went to Bloomberg Business Week, and I explained to them that there's been a rise in the use of electronic monitoring during COVID, and they asked me to go find out a little bit more about it. So during my reporting, which I called from numerous sources, including probation, parole, corrections, public safety, unions, I found out there are about 25 to 30 more prisoners wearing bracelets now than before the pandemic. And the number will possibly continue to rise as industry shifts towards home confinement, possibly from the experience of this pandemic. I had to call the numbers from on numerous different sources. There's not actually one repository of how to find out who is actually using electronic monitoring and how. So to get this information, what I did is I contacted each individual corrections facility, parole or probation offices, or public safety unions to get the numbers. This is actually where reporters or journalists can be particularly useful, because we can actually get information that many, even criminal justice organizations, wouldn't be able to access. They issued me the information because I requested a lot of it as a member of the press and under Freedom of Information Acts as well. So I found out, first we're going to look at Europe. And I had information from numerous different countries, but I just highlighted a few in the slides. In Italy, the prison ministry ordered 2,500 bracelets for the release of 4,000 prisoners. They used a company called FastWeb, but they only ended up using about 1,000 bracelets due to implementation issues. This was something that had cropped up again while I was doing my reporting, is that the countries that ordered more bracelets or wanted more access to bracelets couldn't actually match the technology they were receiving with the staff that they had or the monitoring capability that they had. That was something that was problematic not only in Europe, but also in the United States. So there's issues of fulfillment, product fulfillment at both ends, at the getting out of the bracelets and also at the corrections or probation side, where they found they actually couldn't have enough staff or monitoring or backup to put the bracelets into operation. The Netherlands ordered 1,500 additional bracelets from Attenti. They have since changed suppliers, but at the time they ordered 1,500 bracelets. I don't know if they were able to use it, but that gives you a snapshot of what's happening in Europe. So one of the other issues I explored in my article was what's happening in the United States, since I'm an American journalist based in Europe, but I do have a very deep understanding of the criminal justice landscape in America. And, you know, it's also the largest area of growth. We're definitely not Finland. And something we do have a lot of are prisoners and people cycling through the criminal justice system. It's the biggest growth area for electronic monitoring. Even though they've been very slow to implement it, it has the greatest potential. In the United States, the largest growth was in the federal prison system. As of this week, there is 7,299 inmates on home confinement. The total number, oops, I just lost my, okay, there it is. The total number of inmates from 2006, when the pandemic started, to now, who was placed on home confinement, was 25,192 prisoners left the federal system and were placed in home confinement under electronic monitoring. This is really due to a plethora of factors, but one of them is that the federal system in the United States is the only coordinated, nationwide coordinated system. And the federal prisoners are coordinated across the country, and it's an integrated system. And that allowed them to release prisoners very quickly and get them the bracelets on them the fastest. The rest of the system is divided into states, municipalities, and local corrections. So the federal system is the only national integrated and coordinated system, and it's managed incredibly well. They are planning on continuing with doing early release and home monitoring and confinement as they have experienced a positive outcome from the COVID with home confinement. So that's something to watch. Another interesting factor to think about in the rise of EM monitoring is the jail population in the United States. This is a very difficult population to track because it's historically incredibly transient. But in the United States, it's a very large population. In 2018, the latest numbers that were available, there were 738,400 people in jail. That rate has stayed pretty consistent. The jail systems or the community correction systems in the United States are very, very stressed, and they have been for some time. So some of the more influential sheriffs and jail administrators like Cook County, which houses Chicago, or New York City, which houses Rikers Island, have really pushed for the use of electronic monitoring within their jail systems because they cannot handle the influx of people. They have had some programming in place before COVID, but COVID had really accelerated the turn to electronic monitoring. One of the things that I did find is, so they sort of accelerated electronic monitoring in New York, Chicago, and Wisconsin. But one thing in some of the more progressive states like Massachusetts, they actually chose to turn away from electronic monitoring. And instead, they increased their usage of video calls and phone calls between probation and parole officers and released prisoners. This is for numerous reasons, but a lot of it is political will. In Massachusetts, they tend to be more on the progressive and liberal side. They tend to be forerunners in how they treat their criminal justice population. And they release their prisoners not with monitoring or a form of control, but a form of social and personal interaction. They use a risk assessment or a bias assessment to decide whether if the released inmate is a safety risk or if they can return to their home community. And then they pair them with a probation officer that checks in with them via telephone calls or video calls. And this is mostly used within the jail or pretrial detention population. Once they go to parole, it's more likely to be electric monitoring. The US responded to COVID with releasing a large amount of funds to pay for resources and support to monitor the corrections population under COVID-19. On April 1st, 2020, the Bureau of Justice Statistics made $850 million available to the public safety agencies struggling with COVID-19. Later that month, the Office of Justice Programs announced $70 million in grant funds to support reentry programs. So this opens up an opportunity for business probably not seen in a long time in electronic monitoring. It's a number of factors have to come together to get granted a contract. There has to be, the right timing, which it probably is, but it also has to be support and a political will to try the electronic monitoring. It's been a very complicated landscape in the United States, like it is here. One of the big differences between Europe and the United States is that in the US, a lot of the jurisdictions require that the inmates pay for their own monitoring services, and that has caused a lot of tension and kind of bad feeling between the inmates and the correction system and the public. So there's been a lot of programs stop and start around electronic monitoring in the United States, and that probably has been why it hasn't grown. Also, another major difference between the United States and Europe is electronic monitoring is mostly run by for-profit companies, which get contracts with the municipal or the correctional systems. Many of the companies that are presenting later I spoke to for this article, but some of the companies that I weren't in contact with are larger companies that sell electronic monitoring as a piece of their business, but are diversified in other income streams within the correctional system. For example, Securus Technologies, which is a very large prison services company in the United States, owns a monitoring company called Satellite Tracking of People that provides phone services. And they also provide different security options for correctional use. So the companies that have provide solely electronic monitoring, they've also thought about how some of the technology or equipment can be shifted to other uses, such as COVID monitoring and emergency service tracking for DV, patient monitoring, children, or other. Some of the companies that I spoke to are using this time period to develop trackable or wearable technology, or use some of the things that some of their underpinnings of the work that they've done in electronic monitoring to expand what offerings that can have. I think that's important to think about what media's reaction will be as electronic monitoring grows. Because that is a big piece of the puzzle. Any sort of prison or correction system programming will not grow without the eye of the press. The press will take a look at electronic monitoring, and what their reaction be can encourage a program to move forward and expand and grow, or it could stop a program in its tracks. So it's really important to understand what the press is thinking as they cover this rapidly growing part of correctional implementation. Most journalists don't know or understand what electronic monitoring is. They don't understand its uses or the pros and cons. I would consider, if you do have relationships with journalists or do have relationships with media, is getting ahead of the program and talking to them and providing background information about what you're planning to do, how you're planning to do it, and why the implementation of electronic monitoring in your region is important and can be beneficial to the public safety of the citizens that live in that area. Media is going to be particularly interested in procurement and the companies being developed and awarded contracts as the industry expands. That's going to be one of the main areas that they're going to take a look at, and they're going to probably want to review contracts and all procurement and the way that suppliers are chosen and awarded large contracts. So the media will be following this development closely, in particular in prisons and jails, as electronic monitoring grows. So electronic monitoring, what I found in my reporting, it provides a vast gray area around privacy, ethical, and security issues that journalists are going to want to take a look at. One of the big things that cropped up is the use of privacy and how the tracking of somebody 24 hours a day also creates issues not only for the person being tracked, but for their family and their home and their community. So the journalists are going to want to find out more about that. They're going to want to ensure that the way that electronic monitoring is being implemented is not only good for the public safety and for the community correction system, but for the actually community and where the inmate has to stay. So that's going to be a big issue that journalists will take a look at, and something that I would urge all correctional systems to think about before they start releasing people on bracelets. Journalists will be particularly interested in telling a story. They will use lawsuits, legislation, or characters as a way into the story, as a way to talk to the people that sue or have bad experiences with electronic monitoring. This is something that happens often in the United States. It's a little bit more harder to find and get involved with in Europe, but in the United States in particular, if you're planning on growing in that market, there's lots of, it's a very litigious society. So there are lots of lawsuits and prisoner lawsuits, especially against electronic monitoring. There is quite a number of them. And I know maybe some people in the audience have been involved in that and could speak about that a little bit. So journalists will review lawsuits, they will review legislation, and they will try and find the characters and the way into the story. Anything with tension is what journalists are going to want to write about as well. And then we will also be really interested in the business and procurement relationships between electronic monitoring and the penal systems. So I mentioned, the interest of media at the end, just because I think it's important to consider some of these questions as you expand or become more interested in using electronic monitoring in your correctional system or on probation. As noted in the previous speech, that electronic monitoring is generally a tool of assistance, but it has to be paired with other items to make sure that the community and the public safety of the community is of utmost importance. And thank you. I think I am a little quick, but that's my slides.
Okay, thank you, Kara. We saved the questions for a session after the coffee break.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we take some more time for that. Yeah, so thank you very much for your presentation. Interesting what you were telling also about the media. You are the media, so it's nice to hear, let's say, from a different angle, from a different view, look into, let's say, our business, electronic monitoring. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Then now it's time to move, then we have a bit more time for that, to the sponsors, I should say, the technology partners. Okay, the EM technology providers. For those who attended an EM conference, they will know that the specific CEP conference is always sponsored by selected EM technology providers. And when we talk about electronic monitoring, you actually want to see and touch it too. And for over the years, technology providers became loyal sponsors of CEP EM conferences. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why we decided to give them the floor, to let them share briefly the challenges they faced during the COVID-19 crisis regarding the use of electronic monitoring. Needless to say that CEP is not responsible for the content of the presentations of the technology providers. I will give them the floor now. Each provider has about 5 minutes, and during the coffee break, we will show the content details of the technology providers in case you want more information. The first one to speak is Mrs. Louise Gartland from Buddy.
Thank you, Willem. Ova Omenta. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for your time today. It's good to be with you here on the webinar, but I am very conscious that we should actually be in Helsinki at the moment. So I'm looking forward very much to meeting you face to face next year, especially having seen the video. And in the meantime, I promise that I will work to improve my Finnish. For those of you who don't know Buddy, we are a British SME, a specialist technology organisation, and we're now a global provider of electronic monitoring with offices across the world. We've been developing acclaimed electronic monitoring solutions for 15 years, and EM is actually all that we do. In the field of criminal justice, we specialise in offender management, immigration enforcement, as well as providing prison and quarantine management solutions. So the brief today is to talk about the challenges that we've experienced in relation to COVID-19, particularly in the criminal justice sector. And actually, when I think back to March last year, it felt like there was a very big challenge there. It felt like a mountain to climb. What we were experiencing at the time was very suddenly we faced multiple additional demands all at once, numerous demands from our existing customers, but also many new inquiries. A total range really, more equipment, different type of equipment, and actually different applications of the same equipment. It was a really complex picture. And especially taking into consideration the global situation, we very much wanted to help everyone who approached us. So what we did, we pulled together with our customers and it became quickly apparent what was in good shape and what we needed to address in order to meet the challenge. We have an excellent supply chain that was robust enough to meet the challenge. We needed to up our production, and we managed to quickly ramp that up. So we increased capacity so that we could deal with a temporary or a permanent increase in demand. And not least, we looked at safety. We looked at how to protect the safety of our staff, our customers' staff, and of course, our service users. And we were fortunate that the fitting process, which is the absolute front line of the service, actually can be completed in a very short space of time with minimal contact between the field operative and the person who's being brought onto the programme. So Buddy's resistance and resilience was very high. We were tested and proven during this first COVID-19 lockdown. We delivered to all our existing customers, and we simultaneously onboarded 2 new national programmes. All of this was done remotely from start to finish in 6 weeks. But we then realised when we got to May last year that this was only the first stage, and actually the bigger test was now ahead as we started to shape out and to realise the specific challenges and the pressures that were a direct result of COVID. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about one request we have, which was fairly typical of the type of inquiry that was coming in. We had a commissioner approach us, and they wanted to start with an immediate electronic monitoring programme. They wanted electronic monitoring to start immediately at the time somebody arrived in their country. And they wanted that wearer to be isolated from all other people all the time. As people were tracking through their country, they wanted complete reliability with no location gaps, regardless of the terrain or the demand on networks. And the commissioner wanted to know where that individual was at all times. In addition, it was a preventative measure. There was no crime that had been committed, and therefore wearers needed to want and accept the solution. So we did provide a solution to this and all the other complex challenges that were presented to us by commissioners. The company's performed really well, and we've grown by more than 50% and tripled our staff in the last 18 months. So in summary, really, we've faced unprecedented demand for multiple users from existing and new customers, and we've met every request that's come to us. There's been a rapid increase in the supply of our technology. We've produced newly adapted solutions, and we've produced completely new technology and solutions as well, all with complete reliability. And the good thing about it, we're very pleased to have been able to meet the challenge, but all is that these solutions are now readily available for anyone who wants to use them in the future. And I'd love to hear from you to discuss your own needs. So thank you again very much. And please do get in touch. It'd be lovely to talk to you personally at your convenience.
Thank you, Louisa.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Next speaker is Mr. Ronnie Weinberg from Attenti. Mr. Weinberg, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity being here. My name is Ronnie Weinberg. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing in Attenti. And I'm very happy to talk to you this morning. The first introductions were very interesting, and I think gave a lot of information and interest about the electronic monitoring during the pandemic, the COVID-19. For those who are less familiar with Attenti, even though I see many names familiar here, Attenti is a global company doing electronic monitoring focus actually only on electronic monitoring. We are already in the market for 27 years, delivering our technologies and solutions in basically all the continents, from the US, where we are present in more than 40 states, with tens of state contracts and country contracts and many others. Overall, more than 30 countries in the world, many of them in Europe, many of them participants in this conference. Of course, customers in Australia, in the New Zealand area, in South America, and other markets. So I was asked to try to summarize the last 12 months of COVID into 5 minutes, and I think this is an extremely big challenge. But I would like to say that there are 3 main aspects for this impact. 2 of them are related more to the way the market evolved, and one is our internal adaptation to the situation. But it was a very busy and hectic year, and as mentioned by Kara just recently, electronic monitoring grew a lot in many countries, in many agencies, in different ways. The first segment that I want to share with you, which is not the mainstream segment, but it was mentioned by the general manager in Finland, is the domestic violence situation. I think Attenti is a global leader of domestic violence bilateral solutions, and we are deploying and providing the restraining order bilateral solution in many countries. And this was also right before COVID-19. But during COVID-19, and probably based a lot of that, which was related to the lockdowns and the stress happening in this segment, in this area, we saw many new customers and many new countries approaching us for the need to provide an alternative solution and another solution, which is based on electronic monitoring for the domestic violence. And we see legislation in many of the justice systems in Europe moving ahead in this aspect. And we believe this is a big impact that will have in the market for electronic monitoring, I would say assisting the community on the domestic violence sector. The second topic was, I would say, in the mainstream, the electronic monitoring. Attenti is delivering solutions both on the home curfew with RF solutions, as William mentioned in his first introduction, and of course with the GPS solutions and outdoor tracking. And here there was, and still is, a major demand, and I would say mainly from countries or agencies that needed to release inmates from the prison in order to achieve better social distance in the prisons. I think that you saw in one of the slides that were presented about the numbers in Spain and also in other countries. And this demand or this change in the business not only impacted the last 12 months, but I think it ramped up the level of electronic monitoring in many countries to a new stage, where we see today many programs having thousands and even tens of thousands of inmates into the program, actually requiring a much more sophisticated technology, resilient, reliability, security, and so on. And in that aspect, we saw different countries acting in different ways, mainly because of what has mentioned about the installation challenge. When installation was available in the country, we saw thousands of inmates being tagged, being using electronic monitoring. And I think the major challenge was when installation was not affordable or not available because of the risk or the unwillingness of agencies to use or to get people close to participants in the programs. The third one related to Attenti and how we organize ourselves, and I think this was, we heard similar words from Badi. There was a big demand, there is still a big demand, and we needed to move fast. Of course, we went into the same situation like everybody else in this audience and in the world. I mean, in a few days, the company went remote. We all worked remote from our R&D teams to support and others all over the world. And in fact, it worked, I would say, pretty perfectly. Of course, we couldn't travel. We couldn't meet face-to-face with our customers and new customers. But I think that the fact that technology is today utilized in a good way for remote communication, we enhanced our 24/7 support capabilities, which is based all over the globe. We decided to open a new production facility in the Far East in order to supply all the required demand of equipment and hardware. We were pretty lucky that we were able already 2 years ago to move all our R&D tools to the cloud. So we have more than 100 technology engineers working in technology and future technology. So all of them could work from home. And you know, with time, people came back to the office. Today, we are working on a hybrid mode. And except for the fact that we are not able to travel to customers as we used to be, even though it's starting to happen, and Europe is starting to open, everything worked perfectly. I must say that even with few customers that we had, we installed systems remotely. We needed to be creative using GoPro cameras, but overall, I think the satisfaction was very good. And I think that finally, if I look on Attenti's and the technology vendors into this industry, our goal at the end of the day is to provide technology. But I think the ultimate goal is to provide peace of mind to the probation services, to the correction services. We don't do the actual tough job of working with the participants. We provide technology, and our goal is to bring technology that can deliver this peace of mind and then support you in the right way for you to be able to make your job in the best way. So I hope I could share really in 5 minutes our experience. It was a very dynamic year. We are, of course, waiting for the meeting in Finland next year, and really appreciate the opportunity to participate into the CEP conference this year. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weinberg, for your presentation. Next speaker is François Vigier, I think I should say that, from Geosatis from Switzerland. Mr. Vigier, the floor is yours.
Everybody, thank you for the opportunity for being here. For those who doesn't know Geosatis, the company offers secure, reliable, convenient, and cost-effective offender monitoring technology for the community supervision of parole, probationers, and defendants, and works with criminal justice agency to enhance public safety, improve offender rehabilitation, and reduce recidivism, using swift precision, quality, and innovation. The challenge experienced by Geosatis during the COVID-19 in relation to the criminal justice sector is first the budget allocation. Countries or governments have postponed calls for tenders because part of their budget has been allocated to the fight against the pandemic. Essential services has caused delay on the process of tenders. The second point is the increase of bracelet mainly in the Latin, Africa, and Middle East areas. Within the current pandemic, our customers significantly increased the number of electronic monitoring devices in order to meet the various demands subjective to alleviate contamination within the prison sector due to overcrowding. That let me jump to the next topic. It's a potential delay in delivery, because as we experienced at the start of the pandemic, there were delays experienced in the delivery of equipment to customers. This was due to the availability of flights or restrictions were imposed by many countries. Custom was also affected due to working with skeleton staff, with many working from home. And also as a commercial part, it's the time spent on training and signing contracts. With the pandemic, there have been many countries with quarantine measures on entry of the territory. This made the feasibility on training or signing contracts more complex. It was necessary to provide 10 days on quarantine on the outward journey or 10 days of quarantine upon return from each training or commercial discussions in life. And the last part I would like to finish is the geoscientist technological solution with the social distancing. Geoscientist is the sole electronic monitoring provider in the world capable of complying with pandemic social distancing rules for offender, device installation and removal. Thanks to its unique design and technology, the GeoSatis GPS device allows for the offender to install the device themselves under the direct surveillance and supervision of an officer. Removal of the device can also be done adhering to social distancing standard by the supervision agency, initiating the unique remote opening command via the secure monitoring software, while overseeing the offender during the entire process. The GPS device truly is the only product that accommodates for no physical contact between the supervision officer and the offender for device installation and removal. And the last point is the penitentiaries have complained on the high volume of bracelets are being kept during the pandemic due to its strap design, and that GeoSatis have been their preferred technologies due to its robustness, as it is the most robust design in the world. So thank you for your time, waiting the exhibition next year, and thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Vigier, for your presentation. And we hope to see you in Helsinki. Next speaker is Mr. Barak Trabelsi from Supercom. Mr. Trabelsi, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. First, my name is Barak Trabelsi. I am the COO of Supercom. Supercom, for anyone that's not familiar, is a global provider of technology solutions to governments with a key focus on IoT and electronic monitoring solutions, both for offender monitoring and other monitoring types. We have active contracts and projects all over the world. Primarily, we work in Europe and in the Americas, the United States and Canada. And I would like to try to briefly explain about our difficulties and the obstacles we faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first thing would be related to deliveries of EM projects. Typically, EM deliveries are very complex. They require many on-site and face-to-face meetings with the new customers, whether it's for planning sessions, for training, for installation, for acceptance testing. All these are typically done on site, and in the past, we've always been very, very involved and always had our teams working directly with the customers for these stages. Due to the pandemic and various lockdowns, travel restrictions, we were not able to fly at all to any of our customers, and we had to do at least 2 completely new implementations during this time. What we found that we were able to do is, first of all, work very closely with our customers to utilize remote technologies, a lot of Zoom meetings, a lot of remote webinars and training, and things that the whole industry and the whole world has been doing during this time, but was also very unique to the electronic monitoring processes. Steering meetings in the past would have to be face-to-face, and now everything was remote. Training was remote. Even installations and so forth were done completely remotely. In addition, another way that we overcame this obstacle was by relying more heavily on our local partners each one of them within the country that we were providing service, making sure that they are trained up to expert level and can work on our behalf on all the aspects of the system and continue providing excellent service to the customers. Lastly, in terms of our R&D and development work, we of course had to do remote work as well. We started doing this a little bit before the pandemic, giving more flexibility to our employees and being able to work securely from home. And due to this, we had no impact actually to our R&D during this time. We were able to continue developing, innovating, and of course, implementing new contracts for our customers. The second challenge that we faced was something that my colleagues also expressed earlier, was the increased demand all over the world for electronic monitoring from our existing customers, but also from new customers that all of a sudden had a demand for thousands of devices that they needed within weeks, or in best case, a month. Now, this was a challenge that the entire industry faced, and everybody tried to do their best to supply it. What we did in order to help out and to try to be as flexible and nimble as possible is, since our solutions are based on smartphones, and so smartphones don't require specialized manufacturing that we do, and therefore we had a much broader range of options in order to provide many units in short periods of times. So during this time, we expanded our supported smartphone models and worked with various suppliers to be able to go from 0 to 5,000 or to 10,000 units in very short times and deliver these solutions. We also saw that because of the type of electronic monitoring or offender monitoring required during the pandemic, there were a lot of low risk offenders that were now being sent home for home confinement because of overpopulation in the prisons. And this is the profile of these offenders is a little different than our standard offenders that we typically monitor in these programs. And they were much more low risk and able to receive more open solutions. So again, the smartphone here came into play, being able to provide smartphone solutions for electronic monitoring, and with a bracelet, and sometimes even without a bracelet, which allowed us to provide even more units in a short period of time. The last challenge that we faced was related to supply chain. Sorry, not supply chain, to EM usage that we saw specifically within our customers. Because in some countries, lockdowns impacted courts and sentencing, and of course, installations as well. Our customers, they had periods of time where they were not able to do any installations and the unit count went down. But then every time a lockdown opened up, there were huge peaks and spikes in the amount of installations needed to be done daily. So in order to meet this challenge, in order to help our customers, we did a lot more rigorous planning and forecasting with them in terms of units, how to make sure that even within these spikes, which are very unique and could be twice or 3 times as high as standard usage, they continue having as many units as they need, and that no offender, no sentence would have to be canceled, or someone would have to stay in a penitentiary system because there wasn't enough equipment for them. Lastly, in our services, what we provide in the US, in Europe, we typically provide technology solutions. In the US, we also provide probation services through our subsidiary LCA in California. And there, we also have faced various challenges. A lot of them also related to the fact that during some of the times courts were closed and then opened, and it was kind of a big, it was a weird game of going completely down to no installations or no offenders, and then all of a sudden peaks, but also having to perform these services remotely when it's a very face-to-face task in typical days. So there also we utilized a lot of remote work technologies, video calls, and utilized, again, our smartphone solutions for video conferencing with our offenders in order to continue providing them service and continue assisting with the probation clients. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to seeing you all next year in Helsinki.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Trabelsi. And well, of course, we're looking forward to see you too in Helsinki. We now go to the last speaker before the break, Mr. David Byrne from G4S Monitoring Technologies. David, good to see you. The floor is yours.
So, yeah, going back to COVID, what a ride it's been for us all. I guess the first signs we saw of it were probably in January last year, when we started to see some delays in shipments of components coming from the Far East. I don't think in our wildest nightmares we could ever have realized what it would end up leading to across the globe. So from that, we were fairly rapidly, like everybody else, into a different way of working. Video in many different formats, both internally and with our customers. And to be quite honest, it's worked very well, and it will almost certainly change some of the work practice, I think, going forward as we welcome everybody back into the business. Throughout, we've kept the factory operation open because we've been extremely busy. Some of the reasons the other guys have already mentioned. I guess from a customer perspective, there's two sort of dynamics that we've observed. In some countries, court closures certainly impacted the processing of orders and hence of the caseload, which took some of that caseload volume down. But in many countries, prisoner releases impacted by COVID resulted in significant increases in volumes and hence requirement to ship equipment to our customers throughout the period, really. I think in amongst it all, we've still managed to deliver innovation as well. So we've delivered a new victim protection solution in France, despite all of this, which is live and operating well. In the UK, we have an acquisitive crime initiative. We are using our GPS products to tag burglars, a particular type of offender which has a high is a high repeat offender. So we are now GPS tagging those on release from prison, enabling the police and authorities to associate them with that type of crime across the UK. And I have to say that the caseload, even in those countries where it slowed down with COVID, now everything is opening up. They're recording effectively record levels we're seeing now in France, in Italy, in the UK in terms of the caseload recovery, which is all really positive. From a corporate point of view, you'll probably all be well aware that we had a merger with Allied Universal in the US. So Allied Universal and G4S have come together to create the largest security company in the world by a distance. So we're all really excited about that. So we will obviously have a big play, as well as our fairly dominant position in Europe, to look also now towards the US as a major growth opportunity for us. So we're all really excited about that. That was it, really. Obviously looking forward to seeing you all again as soon as we can in Helsinki, I think it is next time round. And thanks for the opportunity to communicate today.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for your brief introduction of what G4S has done during the COVID and how it is developing, and looking forward to see you in Helsinki too next year. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue with the program, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Mike Nellis. We can fill, I think, the rest of the morning with the CV of Professor Mike Nellis, but we won't do that, of course. But to give you a short introduction, Mike Nellis is Emeritus Professor of the Criminal and Community Justice and Law School, University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. He has a PhD on social work with young offenders from the Institute of Criminology, Cambridge, and for many years he was involved in training probation officers at the University of Birmingham. He has written widely on probation services and electronic monitoring, including Electronically Monitoring Punishment, International and Critical Perspective. I think it's from 2013. Co-edited with Professor Crystal Bynes and Dan Kaminsky. He has served 2 governance working parties on EM in Britain. And Mike Nellis is beyond any doubt one of the foremost international experts on the use of electronic monitoring. And apart from his writing, he has also been an advocate for the rights of people under electronic monitoring. He played a major role in the Council of Europe development of recommendations on electronic monitoring, the first document that accurately put human rights of people on a monitor on the political agenda. He participated in the Pew Center EM Advisory Group in Washington, USA in 2018, and is on the editorial board of the Journal of Offender Monitoring. For many years, Mike was an associate with the organizations of the CEP EM conferences. Mike Nellis is an honorary member of CEP, and good to know is that he has been a probation officer himself. Mike, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much, Willem, for that introduction. I'd be very happy if Martine put the slides up for me. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the webinar today, and particularly to speak about this subject, because obviously, if we go to the next slide, the occasion of COVID has given us many good reasons for appraising the significance of electronic monitoring, and for thinking, as really has been implied by many of the speakers this morning, that this will strengthen the future of electronic monitoring. There is a common sense argument that increasing the use of electronic monitoring to ameliorate the risk of infection in prison for both staff and prisoners would be both helpful in itself and a platform for the increased use of electronic monitoring in the future. And the argument at the beginning of the period seems to have been that if you can take a lot of people out of prison on electronic monitoring very quickly, you raise the question of whether they needed to be there in the first place, and that maybe this will be some kind of tipping point in the balance of the use of prison and the use of electronic monitoring. I never thought it was going to be as simple as that, but I understand the argument. Technological determinism has been around in lots of arguments about what will the future of electronic monitoring be, and that it's such a rational, cost-effective thing to do in countries with large prison systems, that why under these circumstances would you not use it more and then learn rational lessons about how much you can keep using it in the future, right? And we have seen in the pandemic a lot of increased use of remote communication technologies, which in one abstract sense, you can see electronic monitoring as a remote communication technology. So given that there has been a lot of it, the very fact that we're doing this conference on Zoom is an illustration of that. The fact that there has been such an increase in remote communication technology, surely electronic monitoring is going to increase as well. And obviously the best way to answer that is to look at it comparatively. And initially, Willem, I think, asked me to do something comparative. And although I did ask around along a number of my international friends, I couldn't get a very clear picture of what the issues were, in the sense that people could tell me they had this plan and they'd bought this much equipment and they had implemented so many numbers. I couldn't really work out what the immediate cultural context of those developments were. And I've always thought that the development of electronic monitoring isn't something that can be understood just in itself. You have to understand it in the context of an ecosystem of factors. And from my vantage point in Scotland, I just wasn't able to get a clear sense of what the ecosystem was in which decisions about electronic monitoring during the pandemic were being made. So I've fallen back on looking at developments in the jurisdictions whose penal dynamics I know best, Scotland and England and Wales. I'm only going to talk about them schematically, and I will try to draw some lessons both from what happened here and what didn't happen here, combined with what I heard from friends around the world, to illuminate the post-pandemic prospects of electronic monitoring. So Martine, thank you. And the CEP, it's good that we're doing this in the CEP. The CEP was obviously the most appropriate organization in the world, given its track record of thinking about electronic monitoring, to host a a conference of this kind, host a webinar of this kind. The CEP's history with electronic monitoring goes back really to 1998, when the first conference took place, initially planned just as a one-off event. And I think there was a general assumption that electronic monitoring had to be taken seriously as a potential addition to the probation repertoire if countries were serious about reducing the use of their prison populations. We haven't got a great track record. Europe has not got a great track record of reducing its prison populations purely on the strength of using electronic monitoring. So I've just got a message that says to start my video, but my video started, isn't it? So I'll ignore the message. So what the CEP, I think the ethos of the CEP conferences has really been to subordinate electronic monitoring use to probation values and ideals, and to define best practice in electronic monitoring in terms of ethics and empirical research. And what's been worried about is the fear of a shift to technology-based supervision. I think that has not been what the CEP or anybody concerned with probation wanted to happen, although the CEP has indisputably been open to the creative possibilities of using electronic monitoring. So how are we doing? Irrespective of the pandemic, how are we doing on constraining the development of electronic monitoring within the context of probation values and ideals? I'll leave that question open. I don't think in 2021 we're in quite the same place that we were in, say, in 2012. But on balance, I'm still positive about the contribution that the CEP and probation make to the shaping of electronic monitoring. But I think that even before the pandemic, electronic monitoring was breaking free of probation constraints. And we will come back to that. CEP has had a long relationship with the electronic monitoring industry, not least as the sponsors, the people we've heard from today. We have acknowledged that they're moral actors in the commercial sector whose desire to see technology used for good is just as sincere as the probation service's desire to see its skills and aptitudes and capabilities used for good as well. I don't think probation and the technology sector are always going to agree on what the direction of travel in the future should be. But I think the CEP has set a great standard of what a constructive dialogue between people who see eye to eye in some terms, but not eye to eye in other terms. It set a good standard of what that conversation could be. Next slide, please. So Scotland is not a great user of electronic monitoring, even though we've been doing it since as a national scheme since 2002. And we're still an exclusively RF-based system of electronic monitoring. The legislation has been passed to bring in GPS, but in fact, the COVID has slowed down that development. We've never actually done electronically monitored bail, although we are also planning to do that, and COVID set back that pilot. But the numbers steadily went up since 2002, and on any given day before the pandemic began, there were 1,200 people on electronic monitoring. We had a daily prison population that many people consider too high, and at the present time it stands at 7,300. It's been higher than that, but we still have an absurdly high remand population, 26% of the whole lot. And that probably reflects the fact that we don't have electronically monitored bail to take up any of the slack. So tracking and bail were due to start in 2020. Both of them have been postponed. And had they gone ahead, G4S, who deliver the service in Scotland, would have estimated a higher caseload by now, a caseload of 1,600 a day. Court business closed down during the lockdown. Face-to-face social work with most supervised offenders when face-to-face social work became difficult, and most supervised offenders went on to some kind of remote supervision, initially with whatever phones people had to hand. unpaid work ceased, the community service ceased, and a huge backlog of hours built up. Despite all this, the Scottish Government has had no plan to use electronic monitoring more to alleviate rising prison numbers. Why is that the case? Well, that would actually be a complicated question. That's why it's not easy to say for any country what all the factors are which govern the expansion or restriction of the use of electronic monitoring. The government in Scotland, I think, still tends to be quite deferential towards sentences. And sentences, this is judges and sheriffs. And I don't think the judges and sheriffs would have comfortably worn a plan to use electronic monitoring more to drastically reduce the prison population at this particular time. Also in Scotland, there was an election coming up in May of this year, the election we've just had, and that's never a good time to expand ostensibly liberal measures, even though in Scotland there were many offender advocacy groups, voluntary organisations who work with offenders in the community, pressing the government to do just that. So because the courts closed down, daily numbers of electronic monitoring dropped from the 1,200 per day to 400 by the middle of last year. But when the courts reopened, the use of electronic monitoring increased again very rapidly. And by the end of 2020, there were 1,300 people on electronic monitoring on any given day. That's 100 more than previously. And at one level, that's quite a small number, but I'm attaching a lot of significance to that in terms of what I think the future of electronic monitoring might be. It was solely the discretion of the sentencers who made that happen. And the fact that our sentencers in Scotland, who have been skeptical of electronic monitoring, let's say, the very fact that they moved towards electronic monitoring as a solution in this situation to avoid using prison as a sentence any more than necessary, to make up for the fact that face-to-face social work wasn't operating in the way that it should, turning to electronic monitoring was an interesting thing for the sentences to do. Interestingly, those numbers have not been sustained in the new year, but our courts still haven't opened up fully, and there's a question mark, I think, about what the future would be. G4S in Scotland also monitors electronically monitored bail orders in Northern Ireland. And as we can see from the figures at the bottom of that slide, there has been a significant increase in the use of electronically monitored bail in Northern Ireland. And the factors behind that, I think, must be fairly obvious. So next slide, please. Scotland has a strong digital justice strategy, infusing digital technology into all elements of the criminal justice system to make the system function in a more unified manner by communicating more seamlessly with each other. It's a complicated strategy. Initially, it seemed to be police driven. Now it almost seems to be court driven. The judiciary, who I think have been quite reluctant to address technology questions in the past, are now surprisingly keen on this and are setting a new tone in the debate that we're having about the use of technology in Scotland. And I'm inclined to think that this digital justice strategy alone is helping to create a milieu in Scotland that may be more favourably disposed to electronic monitoring in the future. The most recent of the digital justice conferences that we've had here has confirmed that there has been an acceleration of COVID-derived acceleration of existing tech trends in Scotland. Almost every sector was talking about an increased use in communication technology to sustain such justice processes as were sustainable during the pandemic. The line was used, it's no longer just about efficiency, it's about necessity. And in the last of those conferences, the use of artificial intelligence in the Scottish justice system was mentioned for the first time. But alongside the developments in digital justice and electronic monitoring, it's also been this case that Scottish social work has also become more technological in quite surprising ways, quite surprising within the country itself, but clearly it's not a dissimilar development to what has happened elsewhere. They've bought thousands of smartphones and laptops to give to clients to facilitate and sophisticate remote working. And they're just kind of going with the flow about what smartphones can do. Yes, you can talk to people. You can also put programs onto smartphones. And in a multi-agency public protection area, the use of a smartphone to track an individual offender became possible. I don't think that was planned, but it just became feasible because there were smartphones out there. And what people are telling me in Scottish social work, criminal justice social work, is that blended supervision will continue. Now that they've introduced smartphones and laptops into the supervision process, it will probably never be as fully face-to-face as it has been in the past. We are moving towards a situation where we'll use electronically monitored bail. The police are driving that for their own reasons quite dramatically now, and there will be a national rollout, an instant national rollout, rather than a pilot scheme. So next slide, please. England and Wales is one of the oldest established electronic monitoring systems in Europe. We've been doing it since 1999. We use it as a sentence, early and post-release, and bail, and it's delivered by a private company, always has been, currently Capita, and we've been doing alcohol monitoring with a different company since 2019. We notoriously have a very high prison population in England and Wales, always have had, and we've ebbed and flowed in our thinking about whether we should reduce that prison population or not. And at the moment, there are no plans to significantly reduce the prison population from its current high numbers in the 80,000s. The Ministry of Justice here did have a small COVID plan to release 4,000 prisoners 2 months earlier, mostly on EM, but not necessarily on EM. And they stuck with that plan despite criticism from offender advocacy groups, and this was different from what happened in Scotland, that poverty and homelessness make electronic monitoring irrelevant to under-resourced early release and attempts at reintegration. There was actually anxiety among some of these offender advocacy groups that early release on electronic monitoring would have a disastrous effect on some of the people who were so released. The MOJ stuck to the plan, right? At least rhetorically stuck to the plan, and said it would be a trial for the upcoming expansion of electronic monitoring that they already had in mind. And this is the key factor in the English response, I think, that the Ministry of Justice have been wanting to significantly expand electronic monitoring, particularly GPS, but there's an openness to using RF as well, for a number of years, right? At least since 2014. And in September 2020, a very populist type of white paper proposed increases in prison numbers, or at least allowed the prison population to arise from its existing levels by tightening release restrictions. And within the context of that, there was a marked emphasis on increasing the punitiveness of electronically monitored curfews and home confinement. Now, that might just be political rhetoric from a populist government, and it does seem to me that the civil servants in the Ministry of Justice would prefer something less populist and more rational and evidence-based, building on the existing pockets of good GPS practice. But it remains to be seen how that plays out, and the legislation has yet to be enacted. Next slide, please. Now, you can't look at what's happening with electronic monitoring in England and Wales now without also looking at what's happening with the probation service, because for the first time, they are now under a unified management within the MOJ, within the Ministry of Justice, seemingly equal in status as community interventions. It's not that probation is controlling and shaping electronic monitoring as such as it's just an equal contribution to managing offenders in the community with electronic monitoring. And this quote from the Minister of Justice in April, it was an ambition of the government to scale tagging up, and doing early release this way may help understand how effective this tool could be, right? That's what connects the general strategy to expand electronic monitoring with the small COVID plan that they had. Now, whether that COVID plan actually worked out in terms of releasing 4,000 people, I'm not sure. I don't think a full 4,000 were released on it, but perhaps there are people listening who could shed light on that. Now, the probation service at the present time is in a somewhat chaotic state because after several years of being partly privatized, we are now in the process of reunifying it as a national statutory service. And there are good new leaders in this probation service. There are good things being said, good ambition has been expressed, but there are serious staff shortages and an awful lot of undertrained staff. And I think it will be quite a while before the probation service is up to the standard that it was before privatisation. In England, as in Scotland, reduced face-to-face visits by probation has led to increased uses in technology, phone, Skype, text for remote supervision. The probation inspectorate has already seen fit to point out the limitations of that and emphasise that it doesn't want to see it normalised. Now, England and Wales also has a digital justice strategy. There is a strong climate of debate about making criminal justice in general, from prosecution and courts, to infuse more technology into it. But unlike Scotland, the commitment to expand electronic monitoring in England and Wales precedes that digital justice strategy and exists separately from it. So next slide, please. Before we can say what we think the future of electronic monitoring is going to be after COVID, it's probably useful to remind ourselves about the bigger picture of what COVID has affected. And my list of factors here may be a bit Anglophile. I'm not sure whether everybody in Europe would agree that they are the characteristics that have been brought forward by COVID, but increased state regulation of everyday life, vastly increased reliance on remote communication technology in family life, but building on trends that by and large were already existent in education, in business, in consumption and recreation. Businesses and brands that supply these technologies have obviously been empowered considerably by the necessity of using their products in the time of COVID. I think the status and influence of these businesses will be normalized culturally after the pandemic. You know, who'd heard of Zoom before the pandemic? Very few people. Now we all know the names of lots of platforms and lots of technologies that can aid remote communication. We all know much more about that than we did before. The centrality of smartphones to track and trace technologies and the prospect of using them as vaccine passports for travel, I think will also create a climate where we think about the more versatile uses to which smartphones can be put, and some of that will impinge on electronic monitoring too. There has been a widespread popular experience of protracted home confinement, and it's been dispiriting. And I'm not suggesting that that's in any way comparable to being under curfew on electronic monitoring. And I suppose the impact of it could go either way, couldn't it? It could make the populace at large who have been home confined a bit more sympathetic to the pains of electronic monitoring, or it could make the populace think that electronic monitoring isn't that much of a tough punishment after all, because hey, you know, we survive, we find ways of getting by. So which way will that cultural experience, that broad cultural experience of home confinement go in thinking about future electronic monitoring? I think there's been an awareness, this has been a major conversation in Scotland and England, Wales, about deepening class inequality. And that isn't just because of COVID, but COVID has made it more visible, right? The poor and disadvantaged have suffered far more from COVID and the consequences of COVID and the financial consequences of COVID than the affluent and wealthy and comfortable. Next slide, please. So as a number of speakers have already said, using electronic monitoring as a penal solution in the time of COVID, it's not so simple, right? The electronic monitoring service delivery must be COVID proofed. You've got to find the PPE, the personal protection equipment. You've got to alter the protocols on home visits. There will be staff shortages because some staff will get COVID and some staff will self-isolate because relatives have got COVID. Risk assessments can't entirely be dispensed with, but I get the impression that risk assessments have become somewhat looser as a result of COVID in order to justify more flexible use of electronic monitoring. The sudden scaling up of electronic monitoring may not be easy, depending on the availability of equipment and staff at the point at which the pandemic began. Preventing excessive remands in custody does become an urgent task when courts close, right? That seems to be a universal experience, and electronic monitoring is well suited to that. But as the offender advocacy groups in England pointed out, it's not the total solution. Just using electronic monitoring to get people out of prison without providing the support services that vulnerable prisoners need isn't in fact that much of a solution. In any case, some prisons manage better than others at addressing COVID internally, so it doesn't always create a pressure to get people out of prison, although not all the means that prisons have resorted to manage COVID, not least the use of effective solitary confinement, keeping people singly in their cells for 23 hours a day, are defensible means of dealing with COVID. Releasing prisoners with multiple needs and no home to go to on electronic monitoring alone is counterintuitive and callous. Now, I think, as I've said, there's a genuine issue about that. Whether that's always also been used as an issue as to why we shouldn't use electronic monitoring as an early release solution during the pandemic, I'm not certain. But listening to some of the things that were said in Scotland, I'm inclined to think there probably was a reliance on that as an excuse not to use it more than it could have been used. There is also the question that is the home and the local neighbourhood necessarily a safer place to avoid COVID than prison? Most of the people who would have been released from prison would have been poor people who would have gone back to disadvantaged communities. So is that actually the solution that people were claiming it was? The legitimacy of early release from prison, even in an emergency, is always contestable by politicians, media, and police. No matter how well motivated the desire to get people out of prison to protect them from COVID would be, there are always going to be constituencies who say this is offensive to justice, this is denying appropriate punishments, and these people got themselves into these difficulties and they should stay in prison. We've heard some of that as well in these debates, and it's a useful reminder that there is always a media element to that distorts the ration of what would otherwise be a rational response with electronic monitoring. There are voices that are articulated in the media that say the most irrational things. And at the end of the day, many policymakers finish up taking account of what those strident voices are saying. So finally, last slide, please. What do I think the prospects for electronic monitoring will be after COVID? I think the expansion of electronic monitoring, this is a point that I've made repeatedly over the years, is more tied to society's modernizing technological priorities than to the ideals of rational penal practice. If using electronic monitoring was just about rational penal practice, we would have used it a lot more than we have used it over the last 30 years, a lot more. But it hasn't been like that. And I think it's caught up in the politics of an irrational penal system, but it is a persistent presence because modernization in society always requires us to address the application of technological innovations in the public sector. So the question of electronic monitoring is never going to go away, but the issue of using it rationally to make our penal systems more fair and just is in many respects as problematic as it has always been. And electronic monitoring just hasn't been the disruptive technology that I think many of its champions 30 years ago hoped it would be, and where the expectation is that it would disrupt the use of prison. I don't think that's how it's been working out at all. But the pandemic has created a climate that is more favorably disposed to using remote communication technology in general. I think the future will be more blended, a mix of face-to-face and remote communication. I think in the context of that, everywhere, even in Scotland, even in the Scottish judiciary, electronic monitoring will become a more plausible penal option. It will be something that it is harder to say no to, even among people who have been resistant to it. But, right, it's not as simple as that. The impact of technology varies across sectors. That seems to have been profoundly true during the time of COVID. It is differentially constrained. Technology may alter photography, may alter banking in completely disruptive ways, may change everything fundamentally, may have a big impact in healthcare, may have a big impact in education. It may not have as big an impact in the penal sector. Existing electronic monitoring, and I emphasize existing electronic monitoring, can't address offenders' psychological and social needs, the kind of thing that the probation service majors on. And so long as that matters, so long as it matters to governments that offenders' psychological and social needs are addressed and have some kind of priority, electronic monitoring will always have its limits in probation. It will never be able to supersede probation. But what happens if we start to think that addressing offenders' psychological and social needs aren't as important? What happens then? Smartphones and probation with apps, as it has also been called, will become more important. I think a number of people have alluded that today. It looks as though smartphones are becoming a new variant of electronic monitoring, certainly in the USA, but that conversation and that practice has already begun in Europe as well. Now, whether the increased use of smartphones by social workers who aren't necessarily thinking of it as a form of electronic monitoring, whether that will facilitate a convergence with electronic monitoring, I think that's an open question, but it is a possibility. The reason I raised the question before of COVID and social inequality is because those of us who study crime and punishment and have studied it for a long time will know that historically, whenever you get deepening social inequality, you usually get increases in the severity of punishment and a certain indifference to social disadvantage. And I think that's one way of interpreting the rhetoric of the white paper in England and Wales. And in that context, electronic monitoring may well become more punitive and widespread, but not in any way reduce the use of imprisonment. And that seems to me to be the scenario that is emerging in England and Wales. And it's not actually a scenario that is much affected by COVID. I think that was on the cards regardless of COVID, and COVID hasn't affected it one way or the other. So in this context of greater plausibility for electronic monitoring, the defense of humanistic probation ideals and ethics, the things that trained and resourced human supervisors can achieve on their own, will become harder. And that's why I raised the question earlier on when I talked about the CEP's role in the development of dialogue between probation and electronic monitoring. I think it's been a successful dialogue in which the ideals of probation have undoubtedly been preserved, and I think have led to the better use of electronic monitoring than it might otherwise have been. But I'm more inclined to think now that we constantly need to revisit what it means to pursue probation, defend probation. I do think it's harder, but I don't think it's impossible. But it's for others to think about how that's addressed rather than me. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. And I think the last bullet addressing, let's say, the humanistic probation ideals and ethics is what it is all about. I think you're right. That is what we have to do and what we aim at with all those conferences. It's now time for the questions and answer sessions. So I invite Pedro and Cara to join. And Mr. Kujala too, if he's there.
Generally.
Okay. Mike, we can't see you. Oh yeah, there you are. There you are. Okay. I'd like to start. Pedro, can you introduce yourself because people haven't seen you?
Yes, thank you, Willem. Yes, Pedro Ferreira Mahum. As you mentioned, I'm the head of the conference, Electronic Monitoring Conference organization, and I'm very happy to see you and to see many friendly names. We don't see the face, but I am happy to see you all. And my job today is to look at the questions and to ask the questions for the participants, for the speakers.
Okay, okay. Pedro, I see a question coming in from a very nice colleague from Switzerland, Natalia Del Grande.
Yes, but may I start with the first one that was from Ronnie Weinberg. He has a question for Professor Mike Nellis. Why is that in England and Scotland, the adoption of GPS solutions are much slower than in the US or other countries in Europe? Mike.
I mean, that's an interesting question with an interesting premise, Ronnie, because yes, I would agree with you that the development of electronic monitoring in the United Kingdom has been slow. I think there has been a lot of resistance to it over the years, notwithstanding the fact that England and Wales was an earlier adopter of electronic monitoring. But the premise that the United States is a major user of electronic monitoring, I'm not convinced that that can stand, right? I mean, 2 million people in prison, 5 million people on some kind of community corrections, and you still don't have 1 million people on electronic monitoring, right? The United States has not been a major user of electronic monitoring. It hasn't been. It might have been the constant innovator of new technologies, but it hasn't used it widely. And the reason, this will play back into your question about England and Wales, the reason that I think the United States has not been a significant user of electronic monitoring is actually because of punitiveness, right? There is a very strong desire to punish in the United States criminal justice systems. And with the best will in the world, electronic monitoring could never be made to seem like a really punitive technology, notwithstanding the fact that the United States has used the technology in very punitive ways in terms of 23-hour lockdowns and very intensive forms of house arrest. They use GPS primarily for house arrest, despite all the versatile possibilities that GPS gives you. It still seems to me to be primarily used to enforce curfews in the United States, right? And electronic monitoring has made no serious inroads into the prison populations of the United States because people have not accepted, right? Sentences have not accepted, policymakers have not accepted that electronic monitoring is a sufficiently strong punishment to make those kind of inroads. And I think in England and Wales, there has been a similar version, not as intense, because nothing about the England and Wales criminal justice system is quite as intense as the United States one, although there are many parallels. We are both countries that are held to have produced mass incarceration. But I think the way that we have used electronic monitoring in England and Wales has never, this is a good thing, has never satisfied the people who wanted a more punitive response, right? At the same time, there has been a critique from the opposite side of the political spectrum, which says that electronic monitoring is a fearsome surveillance technology, right? And we don't want that to go too far either, right? So I think to the extent that both of those points on the political spectrum, you know, crudely from the left saying that electronic monitoring represents too much surveillance, and from the right saying it's just not punitive enough, that is not a rational debate. But that debate, I think, has been significant, very much in the United States, but a slightly different version of it has been very significant here in the United Kingdom as well. We might have been an early adopter of electronic monitoring, but we've never really debated it rationally. We just haven't. And I can look at a number of countries around the world whose debates about electronic monitoring have been much more rational than ours.
Thank you, Mike. Very interesting, as always. I forgot to mention that Ronnie Weinberg is from Attenti. Now we have Natalia Del Grande. I hope I spell it correctly. She has 3 questions. Mike, it's also for you. Thank you, Mike, for your very interesting presentation, for your raising some highly topical issues. And she has 3 questions. I will ask you one by one. The first one, you briefly mentioned the intention of the police to use EM. Is there any special training for supervision, not only technical and logistical, but pro-social and integrative sensibility approach from their side? Do you know that?
Well,
first one.
If that's a question about how that's going to play out in Scotland, the police are keen to make it happen, but they won't have too much of a direct role in actually implementing it, right? So I don't think they feel any special need for training in respect of the defendants who will be placed on electronically monitored bail. There may be volunteers who provide, from people from voluntary organizations who provide what we call bail support, but I don't think that will be directed or managed by the police force themselves. Now, around the world, where police forces are involved in electronic monitoring, the answer to that question might be different, and I don't know what it is.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I totally agree with you with the balance between those that think that EM is too tough and others that think that it's not enough tough. That's a balance that we have to deal with. The second question has something to do with that. Toughening the conditions associated with EM to be granted to inmates may become a generalized trend of more punitive policy. Given the pandemic, will this become a new normal or just an emergency response for you?
Well, okay. I mean, it is the big question, I guess. And I think the answer is going to be variable because, as I've already tried to say, there are so many local factors that impinge on particular choices that are made about electronic monitoring. I think in some countries we will see a greater use of electronic monitoring because of the way things played out in the pandemic. But in other countries, I think it probably won't change much. I mean, Mr. Kujala said at the beginning that the COVID pandemic had not much affected Finland because they seem to have quite a rational use of prison in Finland already. And there's nobody in prisons who who shouldn't be there, who you might want to kind of decant from prison because of the pandemic. England's reasons for not using electronic monitoring more are at the opposite extreme. We like to punish lots of people in England and Wales, and there is a lot of political resistance to reducing the use of it. So there will be variability. There will be variability. I mean, Cara should perhaps comment on that question as well, because I think it is the $64,000 question in this debate. And I think the businesses themselves will feel more confident. I mean, didn't one kind of got that tone from the business representatives when they were talking earlier on? The businesses will have a lot more confidence that their product has greater utility for people who still aren't convinced that it has utility. So, I mean, can I ask Cara to come in on that particular question of Natalia's?
Sure. Cara, go on.
Thanks, Mike. I think on American side, one of the issues that corrections historically has always faced is that it's a punitive society, but they don't have a strategy. It's a reactive strategy. It's not a proactive strategy. And I think you see that in a lot of countries that implement these type of programs. Nobody, I mean, the public or politicians or legislators don't really understand what EM is. There's not a baseline of its usage, how it's used, how it's implemented, and how it could be positive for society and positive for the penal system. It's not a proactive community. So I think that one of the things that could help move the programming along is to kind of get out ahead of the situation, because the fear is, and it's always the fear, that you release somebody on EM and that EM person goes out and murders a little girl in her bed, and then it's done. The programs are stopped, new legislation comes in, and you have to start again from square one. So I think one of the really key items, the gaps missing around this, is really having people understand what the program is and how it can be reduced to reduce prison populations responsibly.
Okay, thank you, Cara. Last question from Natalia Delgrand. I've seen that in Belgium also. It seems that the number of new cases under EM did not happen to raise during the pandemic, but the number of days spent under EM supervision grew. Do you see that also? And is that about more punitiveness or just a temporary adjustment for Mike, I think?
Okay, I mean, I need to defer to Tom Dames on this really, because there does seem to have been in Flanders a significant expansion of electronic monitoring because of COVID. That doesn't seem to have been sanctioned by the government. It was a kind of a professional decision, and there have been government ministers who have been criticizing the expansion of electronic monitoring during the COVID pandemic. I mean, perhaps you yourself can shed light on that, Pedro. What it illustrated for me is how variable all of this is. And to learn that there was a country that actually used electronic monitoring more to get people out of prison during the pandemic, only to have the government criticize that use of it, that tells you a great deal about the very wide spectrum of responses that have actually existed in relation to this. But what's your comment on that as the person who runs it in Belgium?
Thank you for your question. You know, Belgium is very complicated, so it's not unusual that government has a decision and another part of the country will criticize that decision. But you're right that we have raised the number of electronic monitoring at the beginning of the pandemic because jail system was afraid of having COVID spread inside the prison, and after that they changed their mind and they were more afraid that the COVID will enter the prison than COVID to go outside of the prison. So it was a mixture of each region has his own decision. The French-speaking was more reluctant to give more electronic monitoring based on COVID than the Flemish one, and after that it changes. So if one day you understand the Belgian policy, it's because the people doesn't explain you well. That's how we say that.
Okay.
I have a question that is for all the speakers, and let me try to have it back. It's from Martina Evans. Question to all the panelists, and I will start with you, Cara. Okay. Question, would you say that the general population now has better understanding of EM thanks, so to speak, to the lockdown? And if so, would you think it will lead them to now see it as a real sanction, or conversely, whether they will consider that it's too soft since the rest of the population has had also to suffer from it? I hope it's clear, the question. That's the balance.
I think actually in the United States specifically, there's a moment now with the Black Lives Matters movement and the whole defund the police movement to to have a conversation around these issues. I think what defund the police, I don't think it's really marketed correctly or is very convincing for the general public, but the basic genesis, the idea of it is to use some of the funds that are implemented for more punitive measures and think about some other opportunities like social work or support on EM or community-based corrections has a chance to come into the society and thrive. I think it would be very helpful to see. I think one of the things I find in Europe is that there's disparity. The differences between the systems are really large. Like in Norway, there's hardly any prisoners and a lot of saunas. But in the UK, there's a lot of prisoners. And as you said, in Belgium, there's even a great difference within the country. So, and there's not sort of an overall conversation around Europe. So it's hard to understand. I think country by country really has to make a case about what it means for their population. But I think that there is a moment to speak about it right now. And I don't know if the way to approach it is as EM is a punitive punishment, and this is how we're going to punish our population. And if we use this, you're going to be safe. I think that's not really helpful. I think it would be helpful to approach the situation in a more nuanced way and say, we have an opportunity to, safely bring people that are at low level of risk and low level of public safety back into the community within their homes and their family and reintegrate them into society in a way that's positive, not only for them, but positive for the community around you. And I think that would probably be a more positive conversation to have in this moment.
Thank you, Cara. Mike or Arto? Mike, let's go.
Well, Martin, thank you. I would like to think that the experience of lockdown and home confinement here in the UK would have a positive consequence for the public response to electronic monitoring, right? And the reason that I thought about that at all was because, and some people listening to this will know this, there is a comparative historical study of the Netherlands and the United Kingdom prison populations that went back to the Second World War and explained the fact that the Dutch became very liberal in response to the use of prison, whereas England and Wales became very punitive in its use of prison. This history explained it in terms of the fact that the Netherlands was an occupied country during the Second World War, where everybody experienced some degree of confinement or knew somebody who experienced confinement in various camps that the Nazis had imposed on the Netherlands, whereas Britain, as a perennially unoccupied country, never experienced that, never had a population who understood how oppressive confinement could be, and weren't very responsive to ideas about not using prison in a minimalist way, right? So there is a kind of historical argument about that popular sensibilities can affect the way in which particular punishments develop. And I'd like to think that that would happen with electronic monitoring. But am I confident that that will happen? Not really, because despite everything, and Cara's already made this point, there's a lot of people around in the population, even in judiciaries, who still don't really understand all that much about electronic monitoring. And the only thing that we know that actually shifts popular opinion about the use of particular sentences is when you educate the population very specifically about them, right? And programs like that are occasional. In the main, they are few and far between. So what I would like to happen and what plausibly could happen, I don't think it's going to happen in the United Kingdom. And I think the responses elsewhere will be variable. I think countries that are predisposed to use prison less will be even more open-minded about using electronic monitoring, and the countries that aren't predisposed to a minimal approach to prison this will make no difference to them, is how I think it's going to be.
Thank you, Mike. Arto, I don't know if he's still there. We don't see the face, so maybe just we will have another question now, but give to the speakers a round of applause, because all the participants can't react. I see that emoticons are not available, and when you gave your little speech, you have no reaction. I'm sure that everybody's happy to and very glad to hear all that you said. And now I feel alone, applauding alone, but okay.
Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you. Last question. It's again from Natalia Del Grande. Yes, and that's also for Cara and Mike. To all of you, some empirical results show a very curious dynamic in domestic violence. Actually, it's not so curious. It's a raising of the violence. But here is the question. Is EM totally ready to take the step and become an efficient tool at this stage of the technological development? And if we have reaction from some providers, we can also have. So, Cara, do you have an opinion on that?
So I actually started, as I mentioned in my presentation, I started finding out about electronic monitoring because I was writing an article on domestic violence around using electronic monitoring in domestic violence. And any providers out there want to get in touch with me, I'll go back to it now that the general pandemic has calmed down in some areas. But gender-based violence or domestic violence is such a tricky beast that I don't really understand it fully, like how electronic monitoring will help or hurt it. And I actually would be curious to hear a little bit more from the business end, how it's really implemented safely. We do know that most domestic violence is interpersonal, which means that it's coming in the home. It's usually not reported, and it's usually certainly not reported at the law enforcement level. So I imagine, and I wonder if the business people can come down on it. We have domestic violence courts in the United States and probably throughout the world. So it's probably as an attachment of an order of protection or how, and a court-ordered sanction. So I don't know that much about it, but I'm curious, once it's implemented at the court level, and thrown down to who? Who's monitoring this situation? It's very tricky. So that's just my thoughts about it. I don't have any answers. I'm curious as well to hear from the providers how it's monitored, because
Thank you. We will have maybe one or another provider that we talk. We cannot have a whole speech about that. I think, Willem, we are running out of time. Of course, we will discuss about that at Helsinki in 1 year. But before, Mike, your opinion about that domestic violence.
I think Pedro, she wants to react on this. Perhaps a short reaction, Louise. You're muted.
Yes, sure. I recognise there's not really time to talk very much about it, but I just wanted to say that we at Buddy do have a very well-established service and a product which we've consulted with victims' organisations about, and because what we actually felt was a critical element to this, apart from the safety of the service, that we needed to provide a product that victims' organisations and victims welcomed and that people actually wanted to use. So, we're in a position to deliver on that one. We've been providing this for a long time. The company was actually set up to protect victims when we were established in 2004. And we're in a good position to do that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I know Pedro and Cara that they use it in Portugal. They have an electronic monitoring that say the offender, he or she wears an ankle bracelet, and the victim has a kind of responder, which she gets a signal when, let's say, someone is in the neighborhood of 250 meters or something like that. I'm told that it's not used as a punishment, the judges use it as a preventive measure. So nearly every case of domestic violence is used. And from what I learned from my Portuguese colleagues, it's a very complex system which you have to interpret.
Indeed, we have also a reaction from all the companies have some kind of solution about DV. We have seen a lot of reactivity from there. If we can give just some time and camera to Ronnie Weinberg, and also after that I will come back to Mike, and we will be done with that. Go, Ronnie.
Yes, thank you, Pedro. We're in Attenti. We have pretty much worked on domestic violence programs for, I think, more than 10 years in many countries in Europe, in Latin America. And the main idea is that we are trying to assist the fact that if there is an aggressor that should have not been meeting the victim, we will be able to assist the agency with electronic monitoring to avoid this meeting. I mean, the whole idea, the whole concept is that typically, from our experience, aggressors will not wake up in the morning and decide to kill their wives. But if they are on a restraining order, and we can, with technology and the agency and the monitoring system, and Kara will be happy to give you a lot of information about it, to look on technologies or cases with exclusion zones and inclusion zones and give some alert prior to this meeting, unnecessary meeting. This is basically our role in the program. And as I mentioned in my 5-minute speech, from our perspective, this is one of the most, I would say, growing aspects, because I don't think there is lots of politics in that, like we saw in EM. I think that in domestic violence, everyone is trying to find solutions to reduce the level of let's say, crime or challenge in this segment. So I really think it's a very good idea to spend some more time, maybe in seminars or in Finland, to address more this segment, which is probably very important.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie. Mike, your last word.
Thank you. Well, Natalia's question seemed to have two parts to it. One was about the maturity of electronic monitoring as a technology that can really make a difference in general. And my answer to that is perhaps a paradoxical one, because the way I want electronic monitoring to be used, the way I've always wanted it to be used, and I think the thing that the CEP has been committed to, is to see electronic monitoring as a form of control that supports rehabilitation. That seemed to be the tone that Mr. Kujala adopted at the beginning as well. There is so much more we could have done to use electronic monitoring sensibly as a form of control, right, in the last 20 years than what we've actually done. Some countries have done it much better than others, but in too many countries, including, sadly, England and Wales, there is an obsession with using it as a punishment. Let's keep people in their own houses. That's what electronic monitoring is best used for. And you can use it for that. There's no denying that. And there may be some offenders for whom that temporarily is a good way to use it. But I think to conceive of electronic monitoring solely as that, as if that was the primary aim, the primary achievement of electronic monitoring, I think that has been catastrophic to the development of electronic monitoring. We have companies like Buddy that can develop very ingenious technology. We have countries that have experimented with creative ways of using it. We've got lots of research which tells us what to do and what not to do. But the reality just does not live up to the possibilities that we could have achieved. Now, in domestic violence, I like to comment on that by telling a story from Scotland, all right, which it's a little story that's kind of complete in its own right about domestic violence, but it also illustrates a general point about the balance that one needs to find between social solutions and technological solutions. So back in 2014, Scotland had a working party which was looking at the future of electronic monitoring, and in particular the introduction of GPS, which we'd never had before. And in that context, we thought about using GPS for domestic violence. And there was a general understanding around the table of all the agencies that this would probably be a good and sensible thing to do. Interestingly, the people who had thought about it the hardest and had even read Edna Eras's excellent research on electronic monitoring and domestic violence in the United States, which is one of the best, the most thorough pieces of empirical research on electronic monitoring ever. And at least the Scottish women's organisations who were contributing to this debate about GPS and domestic violence, they read everything in that report. They thought about it and they came back to the table and they said, we can see the value of this. We think that GPS might well have a contribution to make to keeping women safer and addressing the problem of domestic violence in Scotland. But we don't see it as a priority. There are lots of other things we would prefer to see the Scottish government spend money on to protect women who are victims of domestic violence before we get to the stage of introducing GPS technology. And I listened to that and I thought that was fair enough, because the services we have for abused women in Scotland, as in so many places, are just not adequate. There is a lot more that the government could do to provide refuges, to provide education programs, to address the behaviour of violent men before you actually get into an argument, let's use GPS technology to keep the perpetrator away from the victim. And that's my position on it. The women themselves agreed it would be a good thing to do. Victims are supportive of this technology, but it just might not be a priority in the great scheme of things that are needed to make women safer.
Indeed, Mike, thank you for your reflections, always very interesting. We can also add that that technology is very difficult to manage as a professional. It's technology and a lot of training. And so let's see what happens. Thank you for all. Thank you, Cara, for your answers. Arto, Willem, Mike, and let's see everybody in 1 year in Helsinki. You have seen the venue. You will see the venue are very, very nice. The country, as you have seen, is great. And I'm waiting for seeing you physically and have some discussions around a cup of coffee. Willem.
Okay, thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Mike and Cara, and all people who asked the question. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to an end of this online conference on the use of electronic monitoring during the Corona crisis. First of all, I'd like to thank Cara Tabachnik and Mike Nellis for their excellent presentations. And their contributions helped us to identify the importance of our work, I think with or without COVID-19. We talked about it. Mr. Kujala mentioned the increase of domestic violence cases due to the COVID-19 crisis. And Mr. Meinberg mentioned it also in his presentation, and we talked about it. I must say it's what we heard of all our members of CEP, and we addressed domestic violence to the European Commission and the Council of Europe, and it will come back in many of our activities in the upcoming years. Cara Tabachnik mentioned the interest of the media in the use of electronic monitoring, and then especially the lawsuits in the US. And we know that probation is about creating public value. Tell your story to the media, the community, but also to the politicians and decision makers. Mike mentioned that too. Mike, look back on the history of electronic monitoring. I think you mentioned 1998 as starting year, and you addressed the humanistic ideals and ethical issues we always have to face. I think it's ongoing while putting people under electronic monitoring. And you asked, I think, the question, does electronic monitoring help to decrease prison population? with or without during Corona. You also told that Mike, that you could not find a one-size-fits-all solution in Europe regarding electronic monitoring and COVID. You gave examples of the various jurisdictions in the UK, and what I found interesting that you mentioned the blended supervision, the use of smartphones, perhaps electronic monitoring and physical meetings. I know, Mike, you have also a request that if participants have specific information about the situation regarding the use of electronic monitoring during the Corona crisis, which they want to share with you, contact Mike Nellis directly or CEP, the CEP Secretariat. We will be interested in hearing what is going on in your jurisdictions. Of course, both presentations will be available on the CEP website and at short notice for your reference. And as mentioned, the webinar was recorded, and most probably we will publish the recordings of the presentations on our YouTube channel as well. I'd like to thank all colleagues from the Criminal Sanctions Agency of Finland, especially Mr. Arto Kujala, for his contribution. And as mentioned before, the 12th edition of the Electronic Monitoring Conference in May 2022 will be hosted by our colleagues from Riese. And I hope Mr. Kujala's kind words and the video inspired people to register for the conference and visit the beautiful city of Helsinki. I'd like to thank the EM technology providers too for their constructive contributions to this webinar. And of course, I'd like to express my appreciation to all participants for taking time out of your busy duties to attend this webinar. And I encourage you to stay in contact with each other and exchange information and knowledge about electronic monitoring. And finally, the people who have worked behind the scene. The Electronic Monitoring Preparatory Group, who put together the program for this webinar. And of course, I'd like to thank my CEP staff who work behind the scene, always in control and dedicated to make an online event to a success. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Confederation of European Probation, once again, I thank you for joining this online conference. And of course, we all hope that we can meet in May 2022 in person in Helsinki. Have a nice afternoon and stay safe.